Hi there. Have you ever heard about Agile fixed price contracts? Well, it might seem counterintuitive at first, but fixed price contracts can really help you to deliver value in Agile projects and to do that according to the boundary conditions that you have obtained from your stakeholders. In the following, I'm going to briefly show you how it's done and also outline a few key things that you need to keep in mind when doing so. Looking forward. So let's maybe start with the definition of a fixed price contract. So a fixed price contract is I've mainly encountered that in waterfall environments, and the main idea behind that is to offload project risk to the supplier that you're working together with, and you're basically doing that by trying to fix as much as you can the scope dimension through natural language requirements, for instance, a list of natural language requirements that should in detail define the product that you want to have delivered by the supplier. The next thing would be the time dimension. So normally you define certain milestones that you want to have reached throughout the project, and of course the final milestone, if you want to call it like that, the rollout date of the product when the project is considered to have finished. The last thing is quality, which, at least in my experience, is not always defined this rigorously in contracts. But normally you're also defining a few milestones there, be it a factory acceptance test or a site acceptance test, in which the supplier needs to show that for a given test set, normally there it's a bit unclear how this test set really looks like. But however, that for a given test set, the application that he delivers is functioning correctly. And as I said, fixing the three dimensions of the project management triangle is not really compatible with being agile. So, what is really the idea behind saying we want to have an agile fixed price contract anyway? Well, in certain settings, we may need to define a rollout time because, for instance, certain units might be operationally dependent on that. And in the worst case, you need to manage a big bang rollout. And this really requires orchestrating loads of internal and external resources. And shifting the date there or being flexible with regard to the date is not always that easy. Another thing that I've encountered is that, of course, you might just have a fixed budget for conducting a project, be it now something that you buy and customize or something that you make, a product that you make, that you want to operate in. So you want to achieve something, you want to provide your operation with something for a given budget that you have available. Therefore, you can't say that, well, you will get something for this amount of US dollars or Swiss francs, talking about about the local currency right here. And you'd rather say, I need this amount of functionality to support me in operations, and I have this much money available for that, rather than saying we're going to develop and you'll see what you will get for that money, right? So this is basically what an agile fixed price contract is trying to facilitate, I would say, because you should always keep in mind that in one of the main principles is that we are actually trying to value collaboration more than contracts, and the agile fixed price contract is actually more of a framework that you can operate in, and is therefore also trying to help you and the supplier together work on or work in this manner. Okay, so let's maybe go to, let's say, three cornerstones of the Agile fixed price contract. One of them is that you should not try to clearly define scope at the beginning of the project. Why? Well, due to obvious reasons. You start the project, you might develop a few months, and you will see that, well, even after a month, at least that's my experience, a few of the things that you initially thought might be implemented in this manner have already changed. So that's kind of typical, and we really want to embrace change also in such projects. Therefore, you should not define the scope in detail in an agile fixed price contract, but rather should say, I want a given amount of functionality to be released to production at a given date, perhaps, which I'm going to define as being my minimum viable product. So the important thing is the notion of not generating an exhaustive list of requirements, but what we really essentially need in order to start using the new application, because all other things that might come on top should ideally be based on feedback from operation or from the users themselves, and we can still do that in the future. And how would you define that? So, first of all, we're saying minimum viable product. That's one thing. And the other thing is we don't want to be too clear with the scope. So, how one can do that? One approach is that I've made very good experiences with is to say we're using so-called epics that define on a very high level a given user interaction with the system. So you're putting the stakeholder in the center, you're explaining what the stakeholder wants to do and which business value he generates from that. And in this epic, you also define a very basic set of acceptance criteria that span the problem space that lies behind this epic. So you could imagine when trying to come up with a software application, you can define a range of epics that would describe how the stakeholders interact with that application. And in each epic, you would a bit more clearly specify the problem space that lies behind it, but you would never go into detail. So really don't say we need to have a checkbox at this point. There needs to be a validation for this checkbox, or yet another extreme example. The drop-down list should have exactly those arguments, or we need a drop-down list actually. You should rather describe the what and leave the how to the supplier and to the discussion of the supplier, of your team, of your stakeholders that is imperative throughout the project. So that's one thing that we need to keep in mind there. The second thing is that we are iteratively developing that application. So what does that mean? We might be developing in sprints. You can call it however you like. The important point is you're not developing everything in one go, but you're rather saying, I have certain planning cycles. I plan at the beginning, I inspect at the end, and based on that inspection, I adapt my product backlog, the user stories that I've deduced from the epics that I defined before. And the point there is that you're first of all trying to address a complex problem with that. So you're saying developing the application is a complex problem. But this is not the only complex problem that we're facing. So we also have to deal with a variety of stakeholders that might be there from a business perspective, but that might also be related to integration with other systems that form part of your project, of your product. And in essence, you have a whole range of people sitting at the table that need to collaborate, that need to pull into the same direction. And this is also a complex problem. And how do we deal with that in agility? Well, we're saying, okay, we're conducting experiments. And this experiment, or basically one key notion also of this agile fixed price idea is to say we have a few initial iterations, maybe 3 to 5 is one thing there. And within those initial iterations, you're experimenting. So you're trying, first of all, to define or to come up with a vertical prototype for a complex use case that you're trying to address in order to show that from a technical perspective, this thing can work. And on the other hand, you're also trying to show that in the given constellation, your internal stakeholders, the various suppliers that are involved, they can work together. So this team can work. And those two aspects can be addressed in a nice experimental manner. This vertical prototype that I was referring to should actually already be part of your product, because you're anyway going to continue with your iterations. So what the Agile fixed price contract also comprises is kind of a checkpoint after this initial experimentation phase, where both you and the supplier sit together, say, well, it has been a good time. We really did a great thing there. This is one outcome. Of course, it can also swing into the other direction. What you should um, both agree on is that at this initial stage you can still say, well, no, we're not going to do the project. It's not going to work out. Or our initial estimate was wrong. So we really saw that this building this vertical prototype, the integration to those systems is much more complex than we anticipated. Accordingly, the estimate needs to go up. I'm not going to talk about estimation now, but needless to say that you shouldn't do that in hours or in person days, right? But this, let's say, this checkpoint that you have there is also very important, and also is like yet another cornerstone of the agile fixed price contract. So the last cornerstone of the agile fixed price contract is the time dimension. So the time dimension should obviously not be composed out of certain milestones that you're trying to achieve. So saying I'm going to do the factory acceptance test right here, the specification phase will end right there, the testing phase will start right there. It, in an agile setting, we want to compress all of that to one iteration. But nevertheless, of course, you might need to have well, you're not completely isolated from the outside world, so you might need to involve stakeholders that are only available for a given period of time or at a given point in time. So of course you might still have milestones, but I wouldn't center the contract around it. You should rather say, if this is important to you, my main milestone is the go live of that application that we're going to work towards. And in between, we will simply iterate. And we will, for instance, at the end of each iteration, test the product increment that was delivered, and the feedback from those testing phases will go into the next sprint, so the sprint thereafter. This is one approach to do so. If you want to have payment milestones, then I wouldn't tie them to points in time where you want to have achieved something, but rather to what you have achieved. So one approach is to say, well, payment milestone number one comprises or is successful or is reached, better to say, when epics 1 through 3 have been delivered. Accordingly, the supplier will get this percentage of the total price of the of product development, and based on that, you can actually also handle payment milestones in such agile fixed price contracts. But really keep in mind, you should try to only, if necessary, fix the time dimension as with regard to the rollout date that you have in the end. In between, you should be flexible because we are trying to be agile, right? So now comes the quintessential question. How can you come up with a simple agile fixed price contract? So I'm not going to go into the details of contract law right here, assuming that this is first of all dependent on the country that you live in and of the specifics of the guidance or the guidelines that exist in your company. I rather want to explain which components such a contract should have, which topics should be handled. Let's go through the components of an agile fixed price contract step by step. One very important thing is that you should start small in the beginning. So normally each and every project starts with a product vision, and this product vision should be made for a minimum viable product, not for an exhaustive product, meaning that you should focus on what is really essential for your application to be used in operation. Accordingly, this minimum viable product should form the basis for your agile fixed price contract, with the idea being that after this very controlled project that you conducted there, you will be able to, in operations, frequently release to production any further functionality that you might need to also, for instance, have a minimum marketable product or deliver additional functionality to your stakeholders that they might require. The second thing is leaving wiggle room. So what does that mean? I before that said that you should translate your product vision into epics for your product backlog. Those epics are high level definitions of what your stakeholders need to do, which business value they will get from that, and how they will use the application to do so. And you should make sure that you define what your stakeholders need, but not how they need it. This is very important because this thing is something, or the how the epics will be implemented is something that will evolve on the go throughout the project, and that you should also initially fix with your supplier in a product backlog refinement, uh, in order to compile an initial estimate for the agile fixed price, uh, the fixed price that is going to form the budgetary frame for your project. Afterwards, set the rules. I guess that's quite straightforward. So you should define the roles, artifacts, meetings, and iterations that are used in your agile methodology. It's easy with Scrum. You can find it in the Scrum guide. And you should also document what done means for your team. Keep in mind that the definition of done is a very important instrument for handling, or for better said, for controlling the quality domain of your product increment or of your minimum viable product. You should be very minimalistic when it comes to milestones. Just, for instance, define one milestone, which is the MVP's rollout date, because you will iterate within the project duration, and therefore you anyway need to assume that at the end of each sprint, at the end of each iteration, you will have implemented, or you will have specified, implemented, and tested the additional features that comprise your product increment. One thing to keep in mind is that you should always be ready to change the process in which you're working. So new artifacts might come into play, roles might need to be shifted, maybe the meetings you need to adapt. So always be open to that. Also, in principle, when it comes to the rollout date, of course, that's a trade-off decision that needs to be made in the project. Go POC yourself. You need to work on an experimental basis. That's like a very important aspect of any agile methodology, and we're trying to minimize risk. And you have risk in two dimensions. First of all, in the technical dimension, I guess one that's like this in nearly every project. And you can address that best by saying in the first few iterations, you will develop a vertical prototype, and this vertical prototype serves to minimize technical risk and risk that may come from, let's say, not an efficient collaboration between any of the involved parties. You can minimize by using this proof of concept for determining how well your team can work together. One important thing to note here is that at the end of those first few iterations, you should use the insights that you obtained, either in order to say, well, we better fail early than late. That's the extreme example. You might also say that the whole thing is a bit more complex than originally anticipated. It might take longer, it might need more money. You can make that decision together with your supplier, and then accordingly take the appropriate measures that are needed in order to continue the project. The last thing is, I already said it, you should embrace change. This is very important. Your problem or solution space and the agile fixed price are fixed. Nevertheless, you have wiggle room in there, as I said earlier. But your principal solution space is fixed. Same goes for the Agile fixed price after the first few proof of concept iterations, at least. If your rollout date is important, then you can fix it as well. All of the rest can actually change at all times, and you should really learn how to use that to your advantage. You can definitely do so. So that's it. I hope that you enjoyed it and that you now know how you can also work with fixed price contracts in an agile environment. If you want to have some more information, please go to my website at www.entanglement.ch and also subscribe to this channel. I'm going to upload some further videos on agile project management and other aspects in a short while. Thanks and take care. Bye.